My name is Mikhail Chester, professor of civil, environmental, and sustainable engineering at Arizona State University. And today I'm delighted to be speaking with Professor Stephanie Pincetl of the University of California, Los Angeles. Stephanie has worked across a number of topics over a long career, but they all converge around the topic of urban sustainability. And she brings a unique and diverse perspective and a sort of true commitment to interdisciplinarity. She's worked across areas including planning, policymaking, energy use, water, ag, transportation, buildings, and urban development. She's got a repertoire of techniques that are quite diverse and impressive, including energy systems analysis, life cycle assessment, as well as urban metabolism. Stephanie's got a long history of publications in the field. She's spent most of her career in Southern California, but has worked broadly. She's worked from San Diego through Los Angeles to California. She's worked on issues across the United States, and she's worked internationally. I'm delighted to be speaking with her today and to hear a little bit about her perspective of how she came to study the topics that she studies, how she thinks about infrastructure in the Anthropocene, and ultimately how she sees the future of how we understand urban sustainability at the nexus of all of the challenges that we face today. Greetings, Stephanie. Welcome. Great to see you. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Mike. Doing very well. Thank you.
Terrific. And you're calling from, it looks like quite a sophisticated infrastructure there. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Ojai, California, which is about 60 miles north of LA, a nice agricultural valley. And I am sitting in our shed, which serves as our commissary, our office, and a number of other things. We have a little solar array with nickel metal hydride batteries, so I can be online and talking to you.
Terrific. And it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. You are a person that I think of as somebody who is quite adept at thinking systematically about issues around infrastructure, urban sustainability, climate, equity, justice, all of these topics that I think of are often complex. And what I was hoping to do today is talk to you a little bit about how you kind of came to this topic, how you came to think about the topic that in the way that you do. So one of the things that I think about with you, from our work together and, in general, when I read your work, is your ability to integrate lots of diverse fields together depending on the problem at hand. So when I look across your work, I see, everything from medicine, public health, religion, conservation, politics, social sciences, engineering. I think even religion might be in there. It's not easy to do this, to bring together, these ideas, to bring together people, who can kind of come together and work on these ideas with you. So in practice, I think of, bringing together this interdisciplinarity is quite difficult, yet you're somebody who clearly excels at it. Why do you look so broadly at these problems? And what are the techniques that you use to create transdisciplinary thinking?
Well, thank you for that. My dad used to call me a dilettante, so I'd really rather have your introduction than my dad's description. I guess it's because I start from a perspective of ethics and how we can live more, I hate to use the word sustainably, but I suppose that is the term of art these days, on the planet together. And that means not just humans, but also all of the life forces that are there that we interact with and that sustain us. And so how do you create boxes around that is not is really puzzling to me. You just really can't. And you have to look both historically and presently to see how these things come together in different ways. And going forward into the 21st century, I think we have to overcome siloed thinking in order to really be able to grapple with the complexity of the layered pieces that have brought us to where we are today. I've had the very good fortune of finding myself in places where this kind of thinking has started to be defined. So, for example, I was the associate director of an IGERT, Integrated Graduate Education Research and Training Program at USC for 5 years, where the question was, can LA be sustainable? So it's a question that we still ask ourselves, right? But the vision there was really driven by what the IGERT was supposed to do, and that was to bring together different disciplines to answer certain kinds of questions. So I interacted with engineers for the first time, actually. I interacted with economists. That was incredibly depressing. I interacted with urban planners and biologists and geographers. And really what we did was we used this kind of incredible student power from all these disciplines to address practical questions of transition in LA, anywhere from how do you make the jewelry industry more sustainable to what do trees do in the urban environment. And so that combined biophysical, chemistry, social policy in a really fascinating way. And I think I got exposed to things like urban metabolism during that period in the early aughts. And all of a sudden that opened up a whole realm of more quantitative approaches to really ascertaining what these flows actually are, because one has a notional idea, if you are observant at all, that these cities rely on a lot of inputs, and there are a lot of embedded inputs. But what does that actually mean in terms of the amount of stuff, where it comes from, what the social impacts are, where it comes from, how that relates to history and imperialism? You begin to unpack it level by level by level to see, I think very importantly, where we are today and why. And that can begin to open up avenues, if one is willing, to think about future alternatives, because clearly where we are today, the earth, the planet simply can't sustain the kinds of resource extraction that we have today. And of course, we have climate impacts and so on and so forth. So the question really becomes then, how do we bring together these different understandings to, in a sense, make a very thick layer cake that when you cut it and start to ingest it, you get the diversity and the richness of the knowledge base we need to move forward. And I have to say, Mike, that my experience working with you just added a whole other dimension to that understanding. And I guess I'm driven by curiosity, and the feeling that I still continue to have so much to learn. And then what you do is say, oh, well, that's a piece I really hadn't thought about. How does it become integrated with the rest of the pieces that are important to put in interaction to move in a different direction?
Yeah, so I want to pick up on that history comment that you made. I think you and I have somewhat embraced the history of kind of cities and their infrastructures to understand why we're doing what we're doing today in order to shift that target and sort of the processes that we need for change into the future. And this past Thanksgiving, I was in San Diego, and we were at Thanksgiving with my extended family, and we were looking at old maps of San Diego. And old maps of San Diego, by the way, for context, go back to, it's like the 1970s or 60s.
Oh, no.
That old. Yeah. But my point being, when you go back to the 60s, the 70s, San Diego is radically different.
Oh, yeah.
And it's you and I have talked about this idea that, often when we're talking about cities, the cities that I think first come to mind are these older cities, European cities, or, East Coast cities like New York or Boston. And, these are European cities, thousands of years old, the Northeast US, hundreds of years old. But in the Southwest US, Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, these cities are, less than 100 years old, depending on how you look. I mean, they're fairly new places. And, I was thinking about you when I was looking at these maps, saying, okay, yes, there's some context here for understanding, if I recall correctly, you growing up in San Diego, right? I think you have roots that go back to France, but also in Arizona and then Southern California. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. But if I recall some conversations with you that I'm hoping to kind of elicit, this idea of growing up in the Southwest and seeing kind of rapid population growth and sort of how that affected you. I think your first book, if I'm correct, Transforming California, The Political History of Land Use and Development, was about that. And, how did growing up in the Southwest affect your perspective of cities and nature?
Sure. Well, very profoundly. So I grew up in what was rural San Diego. At the time in La Mesa, I lived on Avocado Boulevard, and it was a area that had been developed in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, I would say. Subdivided avocado orchards, pretty large properties, no sidewalks, that kind of rural development. Acre properties, acre and a half properties, starting to be filled in a little bit with more suburban development. And what happened was, across the street there was a wild in quotes chaparral, and I can remember as a kid watching the moon rise over this chaparral and hearing the coyotes, and it was just I felt indigenous. I was like, this is my place, and I would run around pretending that I was an Indian and all this other stuff as a kid. And gradually those gigantic yellow earth movers came in and started terraforming the place and destroying the heart and soul of it. And it was emotionally searing. And the reason why France is important is this: at the 50s and 60s, we would go back to France, particularly in the 60s, and there were still urban limit lines. And so you would have a relatively dense village or town, or Paris was pretty, one of the densest European cities in the world, in Europe, I mean. And I would come back to California and I would see this kind of egregious seemed wasteful. It seemed violent. It seemed so unartful and so lack of caring of place. It's what's motivated my activities ever since. And so I became very interested in land ethics. And of course there's Aldo Leopold and people like Ian McHarg, who wrote this incredibly influential book called Design with Nature. And there were a whole number of these writers who pointed out that things could be done differently. However, at the same time, we have to remember that the West grew the way it did because of fossil energy and an abundance of everything, right? Fossil energy enabled us to overcome space, actually, with the ability to deploy these incredibly powerful machines that could transform Earth rapidly and irrevocably. That was the other part that I found, and I still find shocking, that we can continue to transform the planet irrevocably. Prime agricultural land, extraordinary habitat. We'll just use it for housing or land development of various sorts. And it was the rise of merchant builders, and it was clearly driven by money. Money and the ability to deploy this incredible fossil energy cheaply and bring in timber cheaply and asphalt cheaply, all this other stuff. So that really sent me on this course of trying to think about, well, what are the drivers? And over time, the numbers of drivers in my head has grown incredibly. And to understand the institutional infrastructure, the rules, the regulations, the money that underpins this system that we still have today and still enable in so many ways, because it's become a habit to think that this is the way we should live. The aspiration for the single family house, understandable for sure, but overcome actually by things like social media, television, and the rest, where people actually just don't go outside. They like to think they could go outside, but very few, it's not an interactive environment anymore. People are afraid of having their kids on the street. The streets are too wide, the kids get killed, there's fentanyl, on and on and on. The dysfunction of this system in the 21st century means that it's an anachronism. At the same time, the switch faces things like the fear of the poor, the fear of the homeless. Density still in most Americans' minds is associated with violence and poverty, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, what you would call, a term I like, but is a little arcane, an imbricated system. It's a system where it's like, where do you pull the thread to begin to enable people to embrace the joy, really, of living in a situation where you can send your kids down the block to get some milk, or you can go to the local park and hang out, and you don't need the privatized space to feel safe. And in fact, there are questions of class associated with that, right? That you're legitimated as, middle class or whatever. So I don't know. That's kind of where my head is.
Yeah, having moved to the Southwest, I feel like there is this perspective on development that the desert that often surrounds Southwest cities is, ecologically non-existent or not productive, brown is dead sort of thing. And that sort of gives way to blazing the desert, right? You see it in the Phoenix metro area, you've seen it in San Diego, when in fact, right, the reality is the desert is quite, ecologically active and, productive and unique, obviously, in its own ways. And I think that drives, that's been my impression, at least, of living here, that drives some of the psyche of how we view or don't view urban growth boundaries in these cities.
Yeah, well, so when I grew up in San Diego, Mission Valley, where there's the San Diego River, was not yet developed. And I'm trying to remember his name, the big urban designer who did a lot of work on San Diego. It'll come to mind, I hope, in a bit. There were very interesting plans for San Diego that worked with the natural attributes that the city and the region had, that spared them this kind of slash and burn approach of just putting freeways in there and malls and housing in a floodplain, actually, and then having to harden it to make sure that things don't get flooded. When I was young, we moved into San Diego, and the canyon that we lived on was the first fight to preserve open space within San Diego. And a developer had surreptitiously bought all the bottom land of this canyon and had proposed to cut and fill, which is the typical form of land development we still use, that canyon and put in condominiums. And so the neighbors got all aroused. We petitioned, we offered to buy the developer out, and so on and so forth. But the development community in San Diego has had a very strong hold on city and county elected officials, and they just didn't care, actually. And so the canyon was cut and filled, and the place was transformed, and it was the first of many of these canyon infill projects until finally people realized that these were tremendous aesthetic assets for the city, and that land development process was curbed. But it not only is the desert tremendously important ecologically, but it also has enormous cultural and historical importance for indigenous peoples. And we can't overlook the fact that people have lived in these areas for millennia, and we're pretending as though their affect for place doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, and their knowledge of place, of course, doesn't matter either. And I think one of the most heartening developments in academia these days is the rise of indigenous scholarship, which is extraordinary. It's really, and so that's something that I have found in the past couple of years, so eye-opening and enlightening, and shifting of the way you even approach thinking about a problem. And it's like I said, it's like a flower that just keeps opening with perspectives and views of how you live on our planet, that I feel is both enormously enlightening and incredibly inspirational and important. And how people can't perceive it, I find bewildering, actually. It's like, what?
So one thing that I have noticed in speaking with you is your passion for disruptive ideas. I like to think of it as constructive discontent. I think you've got a penchant for recognizing where the status quo and incremental ideas and approaches are, and pushing people around you well beyond that, sort of challenging, the status quo and incrementalism. And it's something I've always appreciated in interacting with you. I guess the question is, where do you see, is there a place for kind of incrementalism? I know that you've been a very strong proponent of pushing harder, faster, bigger, stronger on issues like energy and climate, that, there's not enough time and so on. Is that an accurate sort of representation of how you think about how you approach research?
So I would say that I also have a very practical side. And so I really put together the team and led the conceptual framing of the county sustainability plan. And we didn't get as far as I would have liked, for sure. And I think that, there was a lot there. Anyway, whatever. But I was willing and happy to do that because I felt that we had the capacity and the responsibility for doing so. And so that was an example of where I pushed new ideas and I pushed new framings, but at the same time, we did the empirical work that needed to be done to support the county plan, like the greenhouse gas emissions accounting, which is all a very flawed process, but we did it anyway. We are now working with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power on their 100% renewable equity strategy. So there again, how do you create a space for new thinking, but at the same time provide the metrics and the data necessary to support a sea change, a shift, knowing full well that we will not get to where we wish to go. So on the one hand, so I think the role of a university researcher is to use the resources that they have, which are phenomenal, actually, relatively speaking, the data that we are able to collect in a rigorous manner, and at the same time leverage that into pushing the boundary and thinking in different ways with what that data tells you, asking different kinds of questions of it, and informing that middle ground where there's aspiration to change, fear of change, and the need for this kind of legitimacy that the data brings. Intellectually, I think my work pushes that farther, but in the realm of dealing with policymakers and bureaucrats and others, I think we have a huge contribution to make that also helps them think beyond their boxes a little bit, right? You have to be careful not to push the accelerator too hard in those situations, because you're going to make them afraid and alienate them. But at the same time, you want to support their positionality where they are in a place where they should be changing things and they know it. I also, I think that, well, no, I'll stop there.
Thanks. Yeah, so let me kind of go on from there. One of the when I kind of read your work, particularly a lot of your perspectives, I noticed that you embrace the complexity at the interface of the dynamics that occur between social, ecological, and built environment, infrastructural type of systems. You're not a person that kind of shies away from those dynamics. And it feels like we are finally getting to a point where kind of the urban sustainability, urban resilience communities are doing a much more kind of focused job of recognizing that those dynamics between those three systems, social, environmental, technological, so to speak. And you've been doing this for a while. I see it in your work going back decades. And I'm wondering, what are the concepts and theories, as you work across those domains that you tend to employ? How do you think about those relationships, those dynamics? How do you make sense of them? It's not something that's very easy to do.
Well, I think I've been driven by the question of equity for a really long time, and power and money. So when you look at infrastructures, they are not neutral, right? And so we've had this conversation and worked together on this concept of the socio-technical system, and to realize that they are not sui generis, these infrastructure systems. They come from a culture and a discipline, largely engineering, that has a whole set of assumptions about how the world works and what the role of the engineer is, that gets reified into codes and conventions and through the various societies that exist that are overlooked and enormously powerful in terms of working with local governments and so forth to create those codes, which are very important for safety and things like that. At the same time, there's a whole, then there becomes an ecosystem that develops around them, that hardens them, and that makes it very difficult to change, like road widths or how dam operations or any number of these things. And so then the question is, how do you then go back to the social system and look at those infrastructures? And you've written brilliantly about this, about how to make them more resilient and flexibilize them into the future. And that's a huge process that has to unravel a whole set of not only ideologies, but vested interests in the status quo, because those engineering firms that design and build, and those concrete manufacturers and everybody else has done very well on the backs of all of that. And so there are obdurate systems, as my friend and colleague Andy Karvinen calls them. But I think what you've done very well, and that I'm very interested in, is looking at there are always moments of opportunity for change. And those moments of opportunity are often around crises. And part of what we in the academic world can help do is think about what the possible implementable alternatives look like ahead of time. So that when there's an opening, we can come in and say, well, take a look at this. And it doesn't mean we'll be successful, but we begin to crack that door open, because chance favors the prepared mind. And part of what we need to be doing is advancing those alternatives. And that's why I'm interested in this future thinking, because it's super important to have a vision of the future that is timely when there's that opportunity, when there's a cascading failure. I mean, what's going on around the Colorado River right now, for example, is an incredible opportunity for change. What that looks like, I don't know. I'm not deeply involved in that directly in any way, but that's an example where a changed hydrology can actually cascade through the system and change lots and lots and lots of things. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, this idea of infrastructure not being neutral is one that we don't talk about enough, and it requires sort of an appreciation for history and appreciation for going into the socio-technical dynamics of the system, and why it does what it does, who it does it for, and so on. And I've always been of the opinion, I think it's something that we share, that you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And in order to understand where you've been, you've got to get into that history. Stephanie, one last question for you to leave the listener with. If you were to recommend a couple of books or 2 or 3 readings to put you on the spot here, what would those be? What comes to mind? I think you've already mentioned a few here, and there's also, of course, your own books.
Yeah, well, I shy away from recommending my own books, but although my political history of land use in the state is actually was the only one of its kind, and after I finish the book I'm working on now, I will revise it and update it. But that's a really hard question. I would say that there's a whole set of really great books about the origins of fossil capitalism that are, I think, absolutely fundamental. I also think that understanding the history of imperialism is really important. The more you read, the more you realize how the world has been transformed. So I would actually start with Amitav Ghosh, Ghosh, The Nutmeg's Curse. It is pretty searing and very eye-opening about how the West just decided it was going to take resources from lots of places and really destroyed many, 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 many ways of life. And that to me is apocryphal. And when we think about the desert today, for example, it's the same line of thinking of our ability to transform environments and people's livelihoods in the name of mostly profit, I have to say. And also there's a certain hubris involved in that. So I think that I keep going back to that and learning more and being more and more horrified, I suppose. At the same time, there are 2 other books I would like to recommend. So I think it's E.O. Wright wrote a book called Actually Existing Utopias. It's a very, very interesting book that provides some examples of ways in which the systems can be transformed to be less exploitative and more to bring the economy back into society. It's a really, really interesting, very detailed book. So I think that's a really good book. The other book that is much more theoretical is Designs for the Pluriverse by Arturo Escobar. It's really inspiring. It's kind of haunting. And if people are looking towards for a book that kind of frames a different way of the future, that's a brilliant book.
Thanks for the recommendations. Stephanie, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
You're really welcome, Michael. Thank you for asking. It was a pleasure.